All right, and we're live. So hello, YouTube and Facebook. This session will be a little bit different than the previous ones. We have a guest. His name is Ed, as you can probably see. Ed, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ed, and I've been associated with the game B world for a couple of years now, off and on in different ways. Rally Point Alpha, and been introduced to the ideas of liquid democracy and the need to do everything differently, and we can really see that happening now. So
Very true.
yeah. So I'm here very interested in what Adriel is doing with Wikilections, and yeah, I don't know where we're gonna go here today, but wherever it is, it's gonna be good.
Sounds good. One sort of piece of housekeeping. In theory, I have an Amazon delivery showing up at some point today for stocking up for COVID-19 purposes.
Sure.
So if it happens to come during this, there might be a minute or two interruption. Hopefully it doesn't, but just a warning there.
Okay.
All right. So quick introduction to just, I guess, the idea of the Wikilection live streams. Intro to the live streams. So the idea behind these is to provide information on Wikilection, and that includes both to improve the design of Wikilection itself, as well as the materials that we'll be going through to explain those different features and aspects of Wikilection. The live streams tend to work on sort of cycling through the main topics that we'll be covering through Wikilection. So that's sort of the core features itself that will be referenced across all of them. And then we have politics, science, and news. This is the first time that we've done sort of the science, or as sort of the full name, controversial science, where the idea is we present the topic in the current state, answer questions, and receive feedback. This seems to be the first time we might actually do that. And then the idea is that these cycle every 2 weeks. And so in probably, about 8 weeks time, we'll come back to this topic again. And the goal is to have sort of updated plans and updated information about how we'll be tackling controversial science, and then keep cycling through them and keep improving both the design and the ability to explain it.
Okay.
For Wikilection itself, the main goal is to use evidence to fight misinformation. In this context, evidence refers to anything that sort of we would use to prove something is true, or more accurately, the people that we rely on for information use to prove something is true. And there's tons of examples out there, but some obvious ones are scientific reports, things that journalists might use, like eyewitness testimony and actual video interviews, and then things that are sort of on the record publicly that anyone can go see. And those are things like court records and government data. So we're going to skip over most of this because this is covered in other sections. But I'm not too attached to sticking to science, given that this is the first sort of session that we're going through this where we actually have someone else to ask questions. We'll use science to sort of guide the at least start of the conversation. But if you have questions about other aspects or just things in Wikilection in general, feel free to ask those. We may end up diverging quite a bit, and it's okay if this ends up being sort of a standalone video that doesn't fit into the regular flow of the back and forth, or like the cycle that I talked about just a moment ago.
Okay.
So when we're talking about controversial science, the idea here is that we're going to go over how Wikilection plans to use the evidence that we talked about and expert feedback to support the discussion of controversial issues. Two of the issues that we'll sort of start with are two of the biggest, sort of most controversial issues in the scientific domain right now, which are climate change and vaccines. Those are sort of two of the starting ones, keeping it nice and easy. Now, while we're starting with science, just to sort of have a place to start, the end goal is this system needs to be able to support all sorts of like different documentation or different evidence that we see. So that includes things like legislation, the evidence that would be used to back up news stories, and then things like economic studies and all the kinds of things that we see referenced in the news to tell us what's going on. that most of us just have to take experts at their word that they're translating it appropriately. So when it comes to reviewing science, at the base level, we're talking about the individual sort of scientific studies that would come out and that need to be reviewed by experts. This is a screenshot from the prototype. It's not all that fancy looking, but it hopefully helps explain some of what we're trying to do. So this is a screenshot of what like a scientific study might look like in the system. So the idea is that there's sort of a different record per study. So if there was, 5 different studies on, for example, whether a certain ingredient in vaccines is safe, then you would take each study and allow different experts to sort of dissect it and review the different aspects of it to see if it's a trustworthy study or not. So that includes sort of storing or at least providing the information about what's in the study, all the text and images and everything. Ideally, we actually want to store the file here so that if there's anything going on out on the internet, we still have the file here that no one can take away from us. Sometimes that might not be possible, especially in the beginning. So that also includes the ability to link out to a study that might be stored on, a different service, right? So for example, like if a study is in Nature magazine, it might link out to that if we're not allowed to store that ourselves. Now, for each study, we want to be able to store what we're calling snippets, and we'll talk about those in a bit more detail, but those are segments of the content. So that might be like a single sentence or like a certain stat that's cited or a chart that you see embedded in the study. So it's sort of an individual thing that then people can reference and we can sort of review how true that is and people can cite it, and of course often do. That's why we're reviewing it. And then the reviews are, of course, the reviews of that study or of that piece of content from a qualified expert. And we see sort of the part of that now where you'll see, even in news now, an article comes out about some new scientific study. They don't generally just show the whole study. There's someone who is hopefully qualified summarizing the study and sort of what we can learn from it. And again, we'll go over the reviews themselves. Actually, that's the next slide. So the goal here is that each study should have multiple reviews from a bunch of different experts. The reviews can store a general sort of overview or a written summary of the study. These are things that we're pretty used to seeing now. So that might be an example of like a news article written about a study that's trying to summarize it. This would be that kind of summary that we're used to seeing. And for each review, the goal is to have an author profile. So the person who wrote it and anybody that's involved. We store sort of who's involved, and then we can list things like their qualifications, any other reviews they've written, and any possible conflicts of interest. Or links, or there's a bunch of other information you may want to know about an author. And so we store that. And technically we're storing the same thing about the authors of the studies as well. So sort of everybody involved, we want to be able to figure out how qualified they are, if they have any conflicts of interest, or something interesting about the area that they're writing in. Is there anything else to keep in mind? You'll see here that there's snippet reviews listed. That is something a bit unique about these kinds of reviews. Instead of it just being a sort of an essay or an editorial, the goal is to actually have sort of smaller reviews about specific parts of the study or document. So if we look at snippets here, we can see an example where the short form of the snippet is how you'll typically see information from a study quoted in media, right? If someone says like there's 62% of people do X, generally that will come from sort of a scientific or an economic study or wherever that stat comes from. So that stat, we want to be able to capture how people will normally reference it. And then the goal there is to show a bit more information about that snippet or about the information that's actually being referenced when somebody cites or references a piece of content. So, on the example screenshot here, the snippet name might actually say something, like 62% of people do something. And then the exact snippet will be sort of the full sentence or maybe a couple of sentences explaining that stat, right? So people that we interviewed were given these questions and 62% of them answered one of these options, et cetera. So it gives you a bit more context and a bit more understanding of the short form version that you might hear. And then we go another layer deeper where it shows that full sort of the exact snippet, but then it also shows the information before and after and anything else that you need for context to make sure people aren't cherry picking stats or using things from the content out of context. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I have a couple of questions.
Sure, go ahead.
So, how are the snippets generated?
So snippets are generated from the users, and technically you can have sort of overlapping snippets. So there's two main reasons that somebody would use a snippet. It's either that they themselves are doing a review of the content and they say, oh, this sentence it is interesting, and they would sort of highlight it because it needs further discussion, or it's because other people, like especially in the media and politics, if people tend to quote a certain stat a lot, the goal is to be able to reference that. So if there's a slew of people saying 62% of people do X, we want to be able to have that as a single snippet that a lot of people might be referencing. And then if that's proven, true or false, or like, yeah, it's kind of true, but also sort of dishonest because it's used out of context, you can have that information whenever somebody cites that stat.
Okay. And is there a way to link related snippets? Like, a snippet might be generated from a particular study or paper, but an interesting related snippet from a related study or paper might be able to put a slightly different perspective on this kind of summary concept.
Right. So do you mean like one study is referencing another, or it's just two studies that are sort of talking about the same thing, and if they agree or don't agree, both are useful pieces of information?
Well, the study references are already contained within the study, so there's already that level of referencing.
Right.
But I guess what I'm talking about is this new layer of referencing that is possible by the generation of these snippets. Right.
So, like, if you're talking about one study that maybe says, as we learned from this expert study, to sort of almost set like the basis for that study where it's referencing another piece of content, right? So that would end up actually being like, instead of a, I don't know what you call it, a citable or a referenceable thing saying like, oh, here's something that we learned from this study, that would actually show as, oh, this part of the study is actually referencing something else. And then just like if a politician says 62% of people do X, if a study says that, that statement is then being reviewed against the original snippet, just like it would happen if it were somebody in the media or politics. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, that way, I think this is on the road to keeping context alive. Yeah.
Exactly, which is super important, because sometimes people just blatantly lie if they cite a stat. And sometimes if you read it, you're like, the stat's in there, but it's 3 levels deep, and the way they're using it is massively dishonest or just inaccurate.
Yes. In the contextual, interconnected world we live in, pulling stuff out in little pieces is, I guess you could say, a form of, information ecosystem pollution.
Right.
Because, the little fact might be true, but it's only true depending on the context that you put it in. And therefore you can change the truth of that fact by putting it into a, artificial context. Right.
Exactly. And yeah, so there's kind of a wide, almost like a spectrum of how honest you can be about a stat. And it's not always cut and dry, but the goal here is just to sort of do our best to say, like, what does the community at large and what do experts say about this reference, how the stat is used. Sometimes they might say, even though it's being truncated, like if it's a full study and you're just pulling one stat out, experts that review that stat versus the study it came from might say, actually, that's an honest way of saying it. It's maybe, you know, not 100% the truth, but they're just trying to boil it down for the public so that they might mostly agree, yeah, that's pretty true. And then sometimes you're like, that number's in the study, but this person doesn't understand it well enough. It's not correct, even though that number's in there. You know, it's a group within a subgroup within a subgroup, so it's not the full numbers as they're portraying it.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Also, you know, a lot of papers and studies are quote unquote peer reviewed, but a lot of stuff is not filtered out of the peer review process. So, you know, a study might, you know, there might be questions as to the statistics used and, you know, how the study was conducted, the assumptions that were made and everything. And so do you see this as a way of basically creating another level of peer review?
Sort of, yeah. A big part here is the goal here is to try to not rely on like a single person. It's about what does like that entire group think. Because one of the areas where I think people have learned, like, or I guess they've lost trust, is you can take something like climate change, where there's a bunch of different news sources talking about it, but they're taking very different, you know, they're learning very different lessons about the information available. And if they're both using experts to do it, how does the average person decide what's true? Well, if you look at the overall, if we're talking about climate change and you say, okay, here's a big pool of all the people that have, you know, added their 2 cents for climate change and what this study means. And, you know, of the people who are qualified, 96% of them say this. So if somebody is quoting that 4%, you can start to see that context of, okay, so here's what they're saying. The overall science does not seem to point this way, and 96% of people in that industry don't agree with that statement. So it's trying to get that aggregate, not just against what people are saying, but also what qualified people are saying, and then starting to compare that to, you know, how right those people usually are. Because if you start to capture every time someone sort of makes a prediction or says this study means that, and you start to learn how often they're true or at least how often they're accurate, we can learn which of the experts that are presented are really the like experts to listen to.
Right. I think too, there's another kind of consensus and aggregation that looks at different chains of evidence. So, you know, in climate change, you know, the idea of consensus is, I think, goes beyond the idea that, you know, well, just everyone agrees on this set of facts or on this context, because there's a even higher form of consensus where you have this evidence chain and this evidence chain and this evidence chain, like ice cores or maybe, you know, historical records, satellite data over an extended period of time, and they all converge on a point. And that's a type of consensus that is not, unfortunately, talked about much in the media.
Right. Yeah. They just have to really boil it down to like the bare bones for sort of public consumption. And there's a lot of room in there for either error or, you know, intentional dishonesty.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I think what I actually have a slide that I think might sort of answer that part a bit better, to sort of say like how you build that consensus and how you actually make this information here more useful. Because this might be useful to somebody who's a scientist who wants to be able to go there and review it. But the end goal here is to make information sort of digestible for the public in a way that they can trust, in a way that's fully as transparent as reasonably possible. Right.
Yeah, that's, you know, that's obviously a huge problem. The public in a time when they need trust in facts is moving away from trust.
Right. Yeah. I like to say that there's a trust vacuum right now because people don't trust media, people don't trust the government, and the experts, they don't know who to trust because those two groups, the media and the government, tend to prop up experts that agree with their statement. But does the average person in the public, how are they supposed to know who's telling the truth? Especially as these sides that aren't as honest get better at spinning that information and telling that story.
Right. Yeah, and any mistake, and something that you see is that any mistake or error is amplified by players who have an interest in undermining, the topic in question anyway.
Right, exactly. And I think another concern is it's not even always like a certain bias one way or the other. Sometimes like a news source just wants clicks, right? They just want revenue. So they'll take something that maybe isn't that important, and like one scientist said something, but they have to write an article. So they spin it as though like, oh, there's some, disagreement over this area in science. No, it's one person. But but that person needs to write an article. So it's presented as, oh, here's maybe something changing in the scientific world before it's really ready to present to the public, where like it's been peer reviewed and multiple studies, and it's actually got enough backing that maybe it can challenge what we currently know about that topic.
Right. Yeah, I think that also, excuse me, leads to, generation of clickbait titles, or
very much so.
Yeah. And that doesn't help, I can't count the number of times I've read a really good article, but the title is awful.
Yeah. Well, and I think that also helps, or I guess not helps, it hurts the credibility of actual experts when the public is seeing experts disagree with each other constantly. You're like, yeah, but that person is not qualified, or they have a massive conflict of interest, or whatever that is. But the media, at least currently, doesn't tend to fully show that. Okay, yes, we're showing this 1% of the person who disagrees, but P.S. 99% of people in this area, in this industry, don't agree with them. It's never presented like that. It's just, here's something to consider, not knowing that it's one person's study that maybe isn't even that good. Which is a part that's not really reflected here. It's not just the experts reviewing sort of the contents. Part of what they're reviewing will change based on what it is. So if they're reviewing a scientific study, one of the things that they would be reviewing fairly early on is, how well does this study sort of follow the scientific method? Where some areas like, oh, they did it perfect in these areas, or, oh, they should have, done a double-blind study, or they should have done this, and this, where that then says, okay, it's a scientific report, but maybe it's not the most accurate. Or it seems accurate, but the author is, heavy in the pockets of a certain industry, or whatever information might be valuable to know there. So it goes through multiple stages. And part of it is also trying to figure out if the person reviewing it has bias.
Right.
One of the things through all of this is a system of almost intentional fake news, but not public. So it sort of says, hey, if we were to present you with this scientific article, was it designed properly? Was it this? And it might be something that you disagree with, but it's still properly designed. So if you say it's not properly designed, it says, oh, okay, that person has bias about this topic.
Right. That actually leads to an idea, and it might be a little hard to pull off, at least initially, for sure. But, one of the problems is that your average everyday person out there doesn't really, there's a lot of misconceptions about the scientific process. There's a lot of misconceptions about debate and disagreement, Oh, it puts up huge red flags in people's eyes as far as trust goes, but it's really part of the process.
Right.
I mean, it is the scientific process. And so, what might be valuable in some way, and I have no idea how to do this, but is to somehow surface the process.
Right.
And to maybe snippet the process in such a way as to make it, so someone doesn't have to follow days and years and months of the actual process as it unfolds in real time, but is able to catch a summary, an accurate summary of how the process on this certain topic, of how the debate and disagreement proceeded.
Right. Totally. Yeah. I think an example of that might be like one of the things that people like to sort of criticize evolution about is it's the theory of evolution, not understanding how the term theory is used in science, versus, the
Exactly.
average person saying a theory. And things like that. Yeah, that's a big part of this. It's not explained so much here. On the politics side, another example of that is like, instead of just showing who you're voting for, showing, okay, if you're voting for mayor, what can the mayor do? What rights and responsibilities do they have? What sort of skills should that person have? Like, so that it's not just saying, please vote. You're getting enough information to know the context of what you're voting for, what that actually means.
Right.
And what powers they have, so that then affects what skills they should have, and so on.
Right. And not just for the general public, but the actual representatives voting on this stuff. I mean, as far as they need advisors and everybody to inform them, because nobody can track all this stuff. Not even representative democracy kind of winnows it down a little bit, but still, the representatives too face the same problem your average voter faces.
Totally.
So, who are they hiring to advise them?
Right, exactly. Because even if you get elected because you're an expert in something, like like the leaders of pretty much all democratic countries, usually they have a certain skill set, but the way that it's presented is you kind of need to be an expert in everything, and no one is. And then, so what do you do? And a part on the politics side is not just tracking like who is elected and sort of what that power is, but like if you're voting on, let's say, the mayor, it's also important to know who can they appoint.
Right. Exactly.
Because then that also affects, well, they don't have these powers, but the person that they appoint do, so they kind of have these powers.
Right. Yeah. They offload, a lot of that power to the people they appoint and the people they hire, and
exactly.
And that's not transparent for the most part.
Right. And it sort of keeps that responsibility at an arm's length, even though they're directly responsible because they are the ones who appointed that person. And, if they make one mistake, it might come out in the math like, yeah, all politicians are going to make some mistakes. That's to be expected. But the question is, it's just a matter of sort of how much. This person appointed 6 people and one of them wasn't great. Oh, okay. This other person appointed 6 people and 5 of them crashed and burned. Okay, good to know. We know about not just that person's skills, but their ability to pick competent people to appoint to the positions that are important.
Right. Yeah, that's extremely important.
So I'm trying to think. I think we covered the stuff to do with the snippets. So we talked about the context. The other part is on the reviews. It's not just meant to have sort of, the typical like an essay or an editorial response. One of the things that the goal is to have is that people sort of leave reviews for the snippets. So there's 2 different ways that would normally happen. That can either be that they're just trying to review the actual source material, right? So they're trying to review that scientific study. And so they're pulling out different parts to sort of dissect and say, okay, well, this paragraph is saying X, and here's what I think about that, and here's what they could have done better, and here's what they did right, etc. Where the goal is to sort of do that for kind of the whole thing. But then you also have those, people trying to cite or reference that study, like in the earlier example of the media and politicians saying 62% of people do X, and they're trying to quote a study. Well, if everyone is doing that, you would have one snippet for that, 62% of people do X, and then a bunch of different experts weighing in on, is that an accurate way to summarize that stat or that thing? And if it turns out it's not, then everywhere that statistic is referenced kind of shows up as being like either completely a lie or mostly untrue, or it starts to show that work everywhere that stat is used. So that you do the work once as a community and say this is true or not true, or somewhere in the middle. And then everywhere it's used, you can start to sort of say, everyone is saying it, but here's the evidence showing why that's true or not.
Right.
So the part that's kind of hard to explain is that difference between the study itself and where it's referenced. And for that, I just sort of came up with a very basic table showing, so there's 2 parts. There's the evidence itself, and there's how you're referencing it. And it's important to make sure that both parts are accurate. Because if you have high quality evidence, like the report itself is good and experts have reviewed it, And if it's a scientific report, they say, yep, they designed the experiments the proper way, they conducted them the proper way, all the things that a scientist might use to sort of just figure out if something is trustworthy or not. Like if it's sort of the word is escaping me now. I want to say qualified, but that's not right. Their criteria for seeing if something is if a report is trustworthy or not. So if they've said it is trustworthy, and whoever is referencing something from that study is being, accurate and honest, then that information is trustworthy. It is like it's an accurate piece of information, and they're using it properly. Great, you can trust it. But then if you have a really accurate, scientific study, but somebody's inaccurately quoting it, well, then even though the study is accurate, you can't really trust what people are saying about it because they're inaccurately representing it. And then on the other side, if you have a low quality, piece of evidence or a study where people, experts have reviewed it and said, "Oh, this isn't very good. They made all these mistakes. I'm not sure I trust the outcome of that report." Well, then even if you cite it accurately, still not very trustworthy. And then your worst of the both worlds is where neither one is good. So you have a low quality report and somebody's inaccurately referencing it, and then it's just hot garbage. Like there's no reason to believe it at all at that point. And so you really need to make sure that both things are true, that it's both a high quality piece of evidence and the way it's being referenced.
Right. You can almost think of it, I think, like a supply chain. So, you have your source materials, your resources, and at each step along the supply chain to a product, you might have some intermediary products that need to be incorporated into the final product. But at any point, if that product is manufactured poorly, or the product or the resource gets polluted in some way, the end product is, is only as good as the weakest link in that supply chain.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. Because if you've got someone who's like a group that's making, let's say, a kind of plastic, and then a group that assembles something with it, well, if either part goes wrong, the end product isn't going to be good. If they're supposed to be shipping you a really durable kind of plastic, and they ship you something cheap and breaks easily, and then you make something out of it, well, then it's going to break easily and it's junk. And if they send you that high quality plastic and you make it wrong, the end result isn't going to be good. So it has to be correct every step of the way in order for you to be able to trust the result. I like that. Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. So in sort of how the information boils up, or I guess is summarized in the end, here's my attempt at it. It's not a perfect way. It doesn't sort of show all of the nuance, but hopefully it sort of explains it a bit. I'm actually going to explain it from the bottom up. So if we look at the evidence at the bottom, that's what we've been talking about so far. So that is like the individual studies. And you can see the layer above it are claims. So those are sort of things that different groups might say, hey, this is true based on scientific research, right? So like we're talking about the vaccines, that might be whether or not a certain ingredient is safe, right? And so you've got a bunch of studies, and then one group says it's safe, and another group says it's not safe, and they're both citing scientific research. So at the bottom level here, the colors are supposed to be showing if that evidence has been shown to be trustworthy or not. So the green says like, yep, it's been reviewed and that's good. The orange says it's been reviewed and it's not good. And the gray says we just don't have enough information yet. We're not sure. And so you can see that the claims that are being made here, right, there's A, C, and E. And partially that was just to make the layout work, but also each claim kind of has an opposite claim. So if, if let's say we're talking about vaccines, and I think and we're talking about whether an ingredient is safe, then one side is going to say, for example, formaldehyde is safe, and the other side is saying it's not safe. And so they're both, if they both cite scientific research, then what we're showing here is, so claim A is cited in, you can see the numbers underneath, is cited in Article 1, Article 2, and Article 5. Well, Article 5, we said we don't know enough about, but Article 1 and 2 are good. So if they're, citing one unknown and two good ones, that's a pretty trustworthy claim, right? It's saying it's backed up. People have reviewed both the claim and the way that claim references the evidence, and it's all good. That one's pretty trustworthy. And then if we take a look at claim E that's showing up as orange, it makes, it's referencing 2 studies, and it's referencing Article 3 that's shown as not being very trustworthy, and Article 5 that we aren't sure. So there's nothing showing positively that this one is true. So it's showing up as, that one I wouldn't necessarily trust. And then if you're saying, okay, but from the claims made by these different sides, right? So if for example, the topic is, in this case, is it safe to inject formaldehyde? Then you've got the sides making their different claims and the sides backed up. And then, the anti-vax side will have a bunch of claims they're making, and the pro-vax side will have a bunch of claims they're making. And you can start to see which claims are actually backed up by science, which ones are actually, disproven by science, and then which ones we just don't know enough about yet. And there ends up being sort of a lot of interrelation. Like topics is sort of a vague area where you're going to have the lower level topics, something like, is it safe to inject formaldehyde? And then a level above that might be, is this specific vaccine safe? And then if one of the ingredients is formaldehyde, it's linked to the lowest level topic of, is that safe? And then this vaccine safe might be linked to the highest level, which is, are vaccines safe? Right. So you've got all the layers, and then it can start to say, okay, are vaccines safe? Well, here's the 10 vaccines that we're looking at, and here's sort of what the evidence currently shows about all the claims that each side is making, what that looks like right now. So we can see here, like if the for side is making these 2 claims that are both proven fairly true, then their side is looking good. If the against side only had 1 claim and that's being shown as not very true, that starts to give you an idea of, okay, one side has far more information available showing that it's true. And then as a person, you can dig as deep as you want. You can go into the individual claims and start to see how much information there is and sort of the more nuanced parts. And then if you really want to dig deep, you can go look at the individual articles, how they've been reviewed, why they're showing what they're showing, and so on.
One question I have is at the very lowest level. I guess you can think of those articles or those studies as being in a certain state of trustworthiness, very little bit. As you propagate up the levels and you're combining these different nodes with different existing at different states, they influence the state at the next level. But what happens if at some point a node at the bottom level is discovered to have a serious error that wasn't seen before? And now that's going to propagate up the levels. And one thing that has actually been brought to my attention in different contexts earlier this week is the idea of things in the virtual world, as there's not really a mechanism for, you could say, forgiveness or to go back and change things. And so, if it's always the case that, an example is, say I get straight A's and I get 1 F that pollutes my grade point average. So, what happens now, the trustworthiness of something a few levels up now sours. And now it's stuck there. So, I mean, is there a mechanism or is there a way to avoid that?
I mean, a big part of it, so this image is massively simplified. A big part of the goal is to have as much of it as possible, right? So let's say if we're talking about the vaccine example, right? And let's say for the topic of, is it safe to inject formaldehyde, maybe there's 100 studies, right? And like maybe 10 of them are a bit sketchy and like, yeah, we're not sure about that. They made these errors, but and maybe another 10 are like, they're okay, they aren't great. And then 80 of them are awesome. If one of those 80 is said like, oh, actually turns out that guy, sells formaldehyde or whatever issue ends up coming out, right? Or they just do a review and say, oh, actually, someone else did a study and proved that blatantly wrong. That one study, goes over into the not great pile. But if there's still 79 great ones, then it makes it look, overall a little bit worse, but still massively in the still pretty trustworthy. But a big part goes back to what you were saying about putting things in context of the scientific method.
Right.
This is meant to be, it's not really ever intending to be like the end all be all, what it says now is the end state and will be, truthful for all of eternity, because that's not how science works. Something that we have some scientific, research information available now might point us in a certain direction, but part of how science works is, you're never sure you're at the end.
Right. I guess I should have clarified what I said by, what I was alluding to was from the public perception. So scientists know how this process works, but from the public perception, you see that all the time. And say in the extreme case where you have 80 studies that are all very, accurate, that everything makes sense, but they're all based on a fundamental principle that they've all used as an assumption, and at some point that fundamental principle turns out to be wrong. Well, now in the public eye, the top level now is forget, we can't trust it no matter what happens going forward as far as adjusting and correcting for that assumption. Now it's so ingrained at this point, several levels up, and I have no idea how to address that problem.
Okay. So I think part of it is the goal here is just to sort of summarize what we know for the public. So if actually what happened is a core scientific principle or something that all these studies were based on is proven false, then basically all of that the lower level that relied on that will update. And all of a sudden, if in this example, the studies that claim C uses, right? That seems like it's probably true. But if the studies, if Article 5 is suddenly disproven instead of being, in a gray area, and Article 1 is also disproven, then claim C changes from green to orange. And you can say, oh, okay, that claim now, a week ago, we thought it was true. Something has changed. Now we think it's not true. And then, now if that was the case, now all of a sudden the against has one negative and the for has one positive and one negative. And so it gives you an update. And then sort of the flip side of that, which I think also happens a lot, is you'll get the media picking a single report that was disproven and saying, oh, look, this was disproven. This casts a shadow on the whole topic. And it might be, no, it doesn't. It was just that one, but there's still 80 that are still ironclad. And they just like to talk about, sort of the controversy to get views and to sort of, have something out there. But it's not actually true that it may be true that one study was disproven, but there's still a bunch of others that haven't been. So we still have reason to believe that thing is true.
Right. I guess part of the solution is to, for people to actually start using this tool and trusting it. And I guess that leads to a question about where you are at in developing this tool and what your plans are for getting it out there.
Right. So where we're at now is sort of, there's a prototype for the 3 different parts. That was the, I guess you could say the politician profiles, because this whole project, as you may be able to guess, but by the name, started off trying to make sense of politics and elections, and being able to summarize the massive amounts of information that if you really wanted to make an educated decision, you could spend 6 months researching stuff and still not know enough. But also, if you do that, you're only getting information for yourself, and then each person has to do that, and it's super inefficient. But with the topics that we cover in politics, right? So whether it's if something is going to create jobs or whether climate change is an issue, there's a tremendous amount of sort of expert feedback that we rely on, right? You can sort of get a pretty stark picture by watching MSNBC for a day and then watching Fox News for a day. And they can talk about the exact same things in very different ways. And as a member of the public, how are you supposed to know which one to trust? And so that's where it sort of branched out into, okay, so we can't just do politics. We also have to look at things like science and economic reports and so on. And then with the kind of information that ends up being available and how you have to digest it, something like looking at, how each news source looks at one news story or, one scientific report, it's a way to group those together. So if you're, if like with COVID-19, right, if there's different news sources talking about it in a different way, the end goal is to have sort of a summary topic saying like, here's what we currently know about it and all the information that backs it up. And then here's how the different news sources are talking about it. And here's how much that agrees or disagrees with the current, scientific consensus. And that's where it gets this weird, like, started out as politics, and then it went into, well, we have to be able to understand sort of expert feedback and start to quantify that and start to really be able to know where we can trust the different information sources in a way that's as transparent as possible. And then that leads to, well, then you have to sort of be able to know which news groups to trust and sort of which experts are showing up, and start to create that history of here's who seems trustworthy and why, and here's the full history, and here's, which news agencies are reporting on this and what sort of bias that they seem to show over time.
Right. Yeah, I guess using the analogy of the supply chain again, it's also about, having the whole supply chain, its history, and its real-time evolution transparent.
Right. Yeah. What might help a bit, because now that we covered the stuff, is we can talk a bit about just sort of like the information model.
Okay.
So this is the part that sort of talks about like the core features of Wikilection, because everything will use it. But in this first, I like to sort of explain how I think about media and how it's sort of currently presented to the public. So in this example, the outer box is the public, and this is, everyone. Because even as you said, even experts still need to get information from other experts on certain topics. So like here, an expert economist is probably still going to require a scientist to explain certain scientific information, right? How the public tends to get their information is through what I call channels. And so that sort of anything that's trying to present information to the public, right? So that's like your national TV news, local radio, a YouTube channel, right? Whether that's like something trying to be news on YouTube, like the Philip DeFranco show, or something, trying to like explain science. It's still trying to sort of take a complex topic or the evidence that you've used to see if you think something is true or not, and turn that into something that the public would want to consume. And the challenges at that level are, you can, like there's a bunch of stuff going on. So by nature, every single channel has to decide on what not to talk about. But that, of course, leaves, you can do selective omission if there's a really important topic, but it makes you look bad or makes your partners or your, the people that you like look bad. You may choose not to talk about it. There's sensationalizing, or of course, that's taking something not that big and making it huge. Like the example of, this one scientific study has been proven wrong, even though there's still 900 other ones that are fine. We're going to talk about it as though that puts the whole thing up in the air.
Right.
And then a thing that I think most people sort of suspect or aren't sure what's happening in their news sources is they can sort of bring on an expert to talk about things, and the experts that they choose are either not that good or they're intentionally being dishonest to sort of skew things in a certain direction, which leads us to the next ring, which are the experts. And so these are the people that take that internal ring of evidence and try to translate it for both the people at the channels, right? Like a journalist may be like actually trying to get to the truth, but they're reliant on the expert that they're working with to properly explain it. So even if they have, they're trying to be honest, if they work with the wrong expert, they may unintentionally be dishonest in their final report. And experts, there's a bunch of different sort of groups, right? So there's scientists that we've talked about. There's politicians, where an important note here is somebody in this model isn't necessarily actually an expert. It's somebody who's saying that they're an expert, right? So if a politician comes out and says something on a topic of science, in theory, they're trying to say, hey, I'm somewhat qualified to talk about this, whether or not they actually are. And then you have things like journalists that are looking at the available information to see if something is true or not. An economist, is reviewing the information available to see how something might affect the economy and jobs, all that kind of thing that we're sort of used to seeing presented. And that gives us the challenges of the bias of those experts, one way or another. Like actually what they believe to be true might not always be true. There's conflicts of interest, which can then sort of lead to intentional bias. And then there's just things where people might bring out, right, like a biologist to talk about something that you would maybe should be a chemist to talk about. But they can still say the person's a scientist, but maybe not with skills in the right area of science.
Right.
But if the people involved don't know, they don't always know what that person doesn't know. So it ends up sort of being a blind, leaving the blind. Right. And then finally, we have the evidence, which is, an example of what we started this off with being scientific reports. But this is everything that these experts use to decide what's true or not, right? So in the world of science, that's going to be scientific reports and studies and that kind of thing. That might be some legislation that's being proposed or passed. That might be an actual court record, like things that are either like 100%, anybody can go and see the voting history of certain politicians on a certain piece of legislation, or it might be things that people don't understand or don't have as much access to. Things like, what a journalist uses for their sources. That's not always clear. And the challenges here are the verification of that evidence as being accurate, right? So that same thing of the qualified experts talking about whether or not that piece of evidence is actually good. And then there's, generally speaking, this whole model is reliant on, the evidence being sort of full and complete. And then you can say if it's good or not. Assuming it is good, you're still trusting that they're going to be accurately referencing it. So if an expert is talking about a study that's an awesome study, they could still misrepresent it. And then as well, if there's one study, that maybe disagrees with the rest and it's still a well-designed study, you can reference it honestly and it might still be useful information. But if there's 99 other studies that say the opposite thing and they're also good, it's dishonest to only report on that 1% as though you're giving the full picture and not saying, by the way, this is, the one study showing it this way, but almost everybody agrees in the other direction. So the purpose of this, let me actually scroll properly, is to now show sort of how that can change. So with the Wikilection model, we'd sort of look at it in the reverse. So for the evidence, there's the community review, which we talked about. So that's the experts in the community are reviewing the evidence itself for any issues, right? So was a scientific study designed properly? Is, like if there's eyewitness testimony or something used by a journalist, why is that more trustworthy than something else? We track who's involved in the creation of it, if possible, right? So like if it's a scientific study, who funded that study? The scientists that actually did it, what sort of studies have they done in the past and how accurate have those studies been? Do they have any conflicts of interest? All that kind of information that might be worth knowing. And then to track the evidence that's sort of talking about the same thing. So if there's 100 studies all talking about formaldehyde and how safe it is in vaccines, to sort of say, okay, all 100 of these are talking about the same thing. And then, if one says it's unsafe and 20 say it's safe, it's important to sort of put that in context when you're talking about it.
Right.
Then the next level is when experts are talking about it, it's important to know sort of how qualified that person is. And then it's much more about not what an individual expert says, and it's about what multiple experts are saying. So a big part of this is taking away the ability to sort of, take somebody who's really good at, explaining things sort of in a certain way to skew it in a certain way and say, prove it with data so that we can boil it up to the top so that if we can see 100 experts are all saying something, if one person is particularly well-spoken, but maybe is bending the truth in a way that it shouldn't be, and the other 99 disagree with them, that can be shown. Even if you're looking at that one person's statement that sounds good, it's being put in the context of, by the way, 99% of people in this role disagree with this person.
Right.
Anything else here? This education, right? Yeah, and then just all the stuff to do with their sort of each individual expert involved and profile behind them, talking about issues that people might want to know about. And in this case, this also includes politicians. So experts here aren't just the people that sort of wrote and might be trying to explain their work. It's also anybody that's trying to reference that work. So again, that can be if a politician is trying to cite a certain thing, you're tracking the fact that they cited that certain thing, so that if over time you see this politician has tried to reference scientific materials 100 times, but 85% of the time they're doing it not accurately, that's worth knowing. Every time they talk about it, hey, just so you know, this person accurately references science 15% of the time, so just be wary of that when you're reading them talk about this. And then here's where sort of that was then talking more about the expert claims and the industry average. And then finally, the channels in the Wikilection model kind of get replaced by like a do-it-yourself, where as we're sort of figuring out, okay, here's what the experts are saying all on this topic, so here's what we can learn about this topic or about this certain story. And then those stories are sort of categorized by the community to say, oh, this is about science and about the environment. And this other one over here is about, business and the economy and job creation. And then maybe something is about both. It's about the environment and job creation. People can say what they're interested in, and then of the whole sea of topics out there, it'll try to narrow it into what they want to hear about. Which then, you might end up seeing things that you don't necessarily agree with, but that's kind of the point. Is if you say that you're interested in science, it's going to show you things that the community said, here seems to be scientific things, and you might see stories that a scientific channel may have filtered out. And then you might see things, of course, that they would have talked about. But it gives sort of the community at large the ability to say, here's everything interesting. And so there's not, a select group of people deciding what the public sees stories about or not.
Right.
Let's see. Right, so talk about the content review and that. You can filter it by interest. Right. And then here, we're also still tracking the stories put out by the channels, so that if you're reading a story, the end goal is to be able to sort of have like maybe a browser extension or something that when you're reading a story, it knows the sort of higher level topic or story that's about. And if this article has been proven to be inaccurate, or, it's trying to argue the case for, the 1% of experts agree with it and the other 99% disagree with, it puts that article in context while you're reading it. Saying, hey, it's not to say that this one is definitely wrong, but just be aware of this while you're reading it.
Right. Okay. Almost like a feedback loop,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Makes it out to the surface and then back in.
Right. Exactly. And so and in the end, it ends up being a weird kind of blurry mess between some of these lines, like especially with these smaller channels. You end up having like the evidence and the expert and the channel might all come from the same people, but then you still have the same levels of, if it's somebody on like a YouTube channel doing a scientific experiment where they kind of are all of the levels, you can then have other experts go in there and review their study. And then, other people can weigh in as experts. And then that person's final summary of what they learned can now be compared with other people's summaries. And then how this all boils down to talk about Wikilection itself, I think I need to update this. This is still useful though, is for the individual people, right? With a special emphasis on politicians, you get a history of things they've said, things they've claimed, how good they are at acting as an expert. How often do they say things that are true? So that you can learn anytime that person is saying something, you get context of how often are they accurate, what areas are they qualified in, and maybe, you should listen, and then what other areas maybe they're not qualified, or they're, have a history of being dishonest. You've got your elections, where that relies pretty heavily on the participants, on the politicians and experts involved to sort of say what they're talking about, what they're promising, but then comparing it to their history and seeing, can you trust what they're saying in the election? And then the topic summary, that's kind of what we talked about now. That was the earlier way of being able to review complex topics and sort of be able to present a summary of where things are at. So that if in the election someone's talking about climate change or if a certain piece of legislation is going to create jobs, that can be compared to what experts think, and then that sort of the whole cycle that we've been talking about feeds into making sure all these areas are as accurate as possible and as transparent as possible.
Right. Yeah, because then you can see, well, if at this level, the accuracy at this level is 15%. Well, why is it 15%? And you go down to the next level, and you can backtrack where that accuracy and inaccuracy is coming from.
Exactly. And with a lot of this, like the accuracy part is kind of going to be true across the board. A big part of it is there's going to be two sort of levels of the assessment and accuracy, where there's going to be what the experts say, and then there's going to be what the community said they need in order to trust something. Because if a certain industry has damaged its own credibility beyond repair, they might say, okay, here are the things that we need to review content. But then the public says, yeah, but we don't trust them, so we also want these other 2 or 3 things that the experts might not care about, but the public does. In the end, if the public can't trust this, the whole thing is useless.
Right.
Because the result is to provide a trustworthy information source to people on complex topics. Right.
Because there is some justification for distrust in experts out there too. So
absolutely.
So we have to keep that in mind, and I think another valuable part would be, like, okay, we could track the implementation or the introduction of a certain policy. We could track how that decision was made, but then we can also track over time how that policy also plays out.
Right.
And that will help feedback into, the experts themselves.
Right.
On not only did they source good information, not only were they good at sourcing information either directly or through other series of experts, but how were they at interpreting that and turning that into policy recommendations?
Right. Totally. Now, what's interesting on that is that sort of is a great example of, if we're talking about policy, you can't always, prove it true or false, because it's policy and it's going to have a certain effect. But it can also sort of like, in general, show the public, like, this piece of policy, is prioritizing this over this, right? So if it's like a piece of environmental protection, you might say, this is good for the environment, but bad for these industries, bad for this business. So that sort of shows you, if somebody votes for or against it, that might hint, okay, this person voted for it, so they have a heavier weight, they care more about the environment than about certain kinds of business. And if somebody votes against it, it shows the reverse, that they care more about kinds of business than environment. And instead of it just saying true or false, or this person is good or bad, it's showing this politician tends to vote this way on this kind of legislation, so you can get a sort of a summary of their priorities. This person tends to vote heavier on the business, or the religious freedoms, or whatever sort of trend you can see. And it's not about saying they're a good or a bad person. It's about saying their priorities.
Right.
So
it allows you to
care about something. You can say, show me, which politicians tend to vote, more towards the environmental side, if that's what you care about. And then people who tend to vote that way, and people who tend, to spend money, and you can see what they spend their time, either fighting for or against, what they value. And then it really becomes about, this can't sort of make sweeping judgment calls and say that, this is a terrible person, especially if we aren't 100% sure on the science that we're using to decide if they're right or wrong, because they might not even be sure, right?
Right. Yeah, I think it allows too. I think there's more and more people that are slowly moving towards a systems view of the world and a meta view of the world.
Right.
And it allows them to zoom out and see, well, we have environmental issues, we have externalities, we have, efficiency in business, we have all these things, but how's it playing out in the bigger picture? If I'm interested in seeing, okay, how does policy manifest in terms of the environment? How does it manifest in terms of business opportunities? How does it manifest in terms of taking care of, the social net system? And to actually be able to see better, how all those things are playing out in the big picture.
Exactly. And then at that level, like if you're saying, here's some attributes about this person, and it says they're, they care about this, they don't care about that, they're good at this, they're bad at that, you can then drill into that. If it says, this person cares about the environment, well, great, why does it say that? And you can click, and then it says, okay, here's instances in the news where it sort of shows that. Here's how they voted on legislation that is in this area.
Right.
So that, if someone says that they care about the environment or business or religious freedoms or whatever thing they're saying that they care about, you can list that, but then you can also show, here's what the history shows. Here's the evidence behind what they actually value or what things seem to hint that they value. And then that becomes a lot more powerful. If we have it backfilled for every politician and someone says, I care about business or I care about the environment, and then you see, well, okay, but you've voted the exact opposite way for the last 20 years, you're a liar.
Right. Yeah, I think this looks like an amazing tool. I would use the metaphor of like Google Earth,
Right.
in order to get a better intuitive feeling of geography, I need to be able to both zoom out and drill in, and be able to do both easily and accurately. And
Yeah.
I think what you're doing here is definitely on that track.
I like to think so. There's still a lot of steps in between there and having it there. A big part of it is trying to take complex information and present it in a way that it's probably never been presented before, or at least not sort of all at the same time. Like an example of that is when we're looking at the information for a politician. There's the timeline. Like you can go out there and see information about a politician, right? So like here's their job history. Here's things you might want to know. So here's an example of like in this case, it's a candidate that's participating in an election, and if you wanted to drill into the information, you can see a timeline of their sort of job history, and then these things here for politicians are just their important events. And you can see sort of where they happened in their timeline and how often they happened. And then each thing has its own sort of flags, like we talked about earlier. So here it's, about this person, while they were a council member, had 3 different instances of getting in trouble for excessive expenses. So this shows maybe they're not great with public money. And then if you see a bunch of those examples over time, plus the community can vote on what's important or not, one of the goals there is to help sort of fix the public's really short memory, where as long as a politician hasn't screwed up majorly in the last 3 months before an election, all the stuff in the past can easily sort of be forgotten about. But whereas if you say, oh, I forgot that person did that, 6 or 12 months in, that was 3 years ago, I forgot. But yeah, that was important. And that does show a lack of judgment or they have malice or whatever it shows about that person. It's about capturing it and then always having that on their file so that you can tell, here's what we've learned about that person. Like if we go look at the summary for this person, you can say, okay, here's some sort of tag about that person. They've done charity, they've done arts, but there's a negative here under finance because maybe they have multiple things that say they're bad with finance. You can drill in and see what the information is. And you can start to get a snapshot of, if we're trying to compare candidates, you can, compare apples to apples, but then also it's trying to summarize things like, here's the people that they appointed, and here's how well those people did at their jobs. Here's the previous positions this person held in government, and here's how well they did at their job.
Yeah, I think it's important to see the timelines too, because another thing is that people change over time.
Yeah.
And so if you can see their timelines, you can see their actions, you can see what they say, it'll help you discern about, I think it's important in regards character and stuff of why they're changing.
Right.
Is this person changing because they've actually trying to be more accurate or more truthful in what they're saying, or are they changing because they're incentivized towards profit or power or whatever?
Right, yeah. Or do they just say whatever the person in front of them wants to hear? Or if it shows like they have multiple viewpoints over time, why? can you sort of see a type of consistency, a certain point where it changed, and then they're consistent for that new point going forward? That's not so bad. If they're constantly going back and forth, then you don't really know, okay, can I trust what they're saying? And that's a big part of it. And then something else, like to look at a different type of content to review. Here's an example of how you might be able to review like a video. So if this is an example of a politician at a rally talking about something, you've got your typical video player and the timeline, but right underneath that, these are sort of the video snippets where, like in this example, it's just going into item number 3, where in that point in the video, he's talking about the fact where he's claiming that traffic got better during his time as mayor. And then you can see, okay, the community says that is mostly false, right? So they reviewed that claim, and then underneath it says why. So it says, yeah, some areas got better, but in the really important areas that are high density, it got way worse. So saying it got better is, it like not fully accurate or just a straight up lie.
Right.
And then you've got sort of each claim in the video where some things might not even be verifiable, right? If he makes a promise, then you can't verify that's true or false yet. If he says, if you elect me, I'm going to build a new arena, well, we can't tell that's going to happen until he either does it or doesn't do it. But we can record that he said it. So that if in the future we say, I never said that I built an arena, well, here's the 38 videos from the election of you saying that.
Right. Wow.
And then you can start, doing things like capturing all of somebody's campaign promises, so that if they come up for re-election next time, you say, well, here's the campaign promises they made. Here's how many of those they've fulfilled. So keep that in mind when they're making campaign promises this time around. Right.
Yeah. One of the problems out there is all this stuff is out there. It's all digitally captured, but it's not easy to find and put together.
Right.
That single fact is, taken advantage of by politicians that, there's a video out there of me saying this, but, who's going to actually take the time to go dig that up?
Right. Exactly. And if there's so many different pieces of information, it's pretty easy to get lost in just the ocean of information. The other thing that my sort of end goal for this is for this to end up, it has got a library of all of this media. And then one of the things I think that we need to specialize in is detecting manipulated media. So like, has this video been deep faked? Does, are there signs of audio manipulation or whatever that is, so that if it sees this video and it knows it's true, and it sort of also has these, stamps of when the person is saying things and what's there, well, then if you've got, like going back to the example of having a browser extension, you might be able to say, if somebody is watching something that we know is this video on YouTube or Facebook, we can then overlay these snippets. So even if Facebook or YouTube don't want to show if something is true or not, it can say, well, we know if what this person is saying is true or not. So we're going to show it everywhere we can that this video is played, whether that website wants to or not.
Right. I think one of the ways right now that deepfakes and similar technologies can be effective is because they're able to operate basically context free.
Right.
So the context become not the pattern, not the pattern of the person that they're faking. So if you look at the actual pattern, you can see the spike shoot up. That this is completely out of context.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's times where it might even be, as you said, it might not be faked, but it might be like, I'm really skeptical anytime someone shows a video of someone saying something for proof, and that like you can tell it starts in the middle of a sentence.
Right.
And you're like, okay, I'm already massively distrustful. What was, the two sentences leading up to that, and the first half of the sentence you cut, what were they saying? Like an example here was there was a politician that said something as a joke, where the lead up to the joke, you could obviously tell it was a joke. And then when certain media outlets reported on it, they started in the middle of a sentence. It was like an 8.5 second clip you're like, that just reeks of out of context.
Right.
And so if you have the original video, one of the things that you could do with like a browser extension is, by the way, we know that this clip is, is snipped out of this. If you want to see the original, click here. Or if you want to see the 10 seconds leading up to it, click here.
Mm-hmm.
And then you may even just flag that video as a snippet that's been proved to be dishonest or out of context.
Right. Yeah, very, very true. Very true.
Yeah, so as you can tell, there's a lot to it and a lot to sort of do. The end goal, like, a lot of this, I don't know of technology that exists that does most of this, so it'll end up being something sort of created from scratch. And a big part of this is, so far, it's pretty much just been my input. And I've, done a fair amount of sort of product management work to know that most likely this is going to change drastically as it's being developed, as we have feedback from the community, as people start to say why they do or don't trust something. We might say, oh, I didn't realize that was a reason why some people did distrust information. So now we have to handle that.
Right.
And so things will end up changing, I'm sure, a fair bit in between, what the sort of mock-ups and prototypes show. But the end result is just to give people an information source that's able to be trusted.
Right. Right. No, it's a simple mission, but the implementation of it is very complex.
Yeah, partially because there's a lot of well-resourced and sort of seasoned groups out there whose job is to spread misinformation. And this and project takes on all of those.
Right.
And all of the groups that aren't necessarily doing it themselves, but that benefit massively from the misinformation being available. So this steps on a lot of toes.
Basically a whole industry.
Yeah.
And
all the industries that rely on that information to make more money and, cut off some legislation and change things in their favor. And so it'll end up being, and that's part of the reason why, because I think you've been involved in Together Tech to some extent, right? Like I think you've joined sort of some of the sessions, or like the meta project, as I think we've also called it.
Yeah, and I've listened in more than I've participated, but yeah.
One of the things that I think I always knew was going to be a problem that I had to solve here, but that has moved over to Together Tech because a bunch of problems are going to have to solve it, is that issue of trust. Is what do you need to trust something? Because if this all gets built, but people don't trust it, you just throw it in the garbage because the whole point goes out the window. So it has to be built from the ground up to make sure that it's ticking those boxes. And part of it is going to be what information it shows and how transparent it is and how deep you can go and how good of a job it does explaining complex topics. But then a part of it is also like how transparent the organization is, how how much public feedback it is incorporated, all that kind of thing. With that part, I mean, there's a bunch of companies trying to do other things where they require a massive amount of public trust. And so we need to figure out, what does that mean for the public to trust, an organization that claims it's trying to do good work? Why should they trust that over, an existing news source? Right.
I think part of that probably is to just get people using it, and, if someone actually uses something and, and they have a stake in it, they have skin in the game in some way, and they have the ability to feed back their experience, that helps grow trust. There's a lot more to it than that, but I think that's part of it.
Yeah, I think the game will come once it's actually, like, the proof is in the pudding, as it were. So if we actually get this up and online and it's starting to sort of summarize topics, that even if it's showing you information that you mostly disagree with, if it's showing some things that you agree with and it's actually proving, some of your beliefs correct and then other ones incorrect, I think, because I'm almost certain that's what's going to end up happening. There's not going to be any one group that's proven 100% correct.
Right.
It's going to show those. And as long as you're willing to do that, I think that alone builds a lot of trust, because you can see groups where you're like, there's obvious bias there. They aren't talking about certain stories or skewing it in a certain way. And the more that you do that, the more that you lose trust. And so if this is
Right.
saying really brutal truths, like, if we talk about 10 controversial scientific topics and one of them goes against the grain, I think the other, people who like maybe, don't believe in vaccines, if the vaccine debate ends up proving heavily towards, yeah, vaccines are safe, but then, some other controversial study actually agrees with them and is like, oh, we actually don't know that much about that topic. I think that lends credence to, oh, if they were willing to say that thing is untrue, maybe this is true.
Right. And I think there's just enough people. I mean, probably the majority of people, interpret facts as a means to reinforce their social group.
Right.
But I think there's enough people that if they were able to access and see the transparent process here, are willing to change the way they think about certain facts.
Right.
But only if they trust the process.
Right.
And you don't need a majority of people that are willing to engage in that way and open their minds. There's a certain threshold, I don't know what it is, but a certain threshold of people that once you cross over that, change can actually happen.
Right. Yeah. Well, so many of the things that happen in our society are determined by like the smallest of margins of people. Like the U.S. elections are always a great example of that. Over 300 million people, and the elections are so often within like 1 or 2%.
Right.
It's like, that's insane.
And
right. So
it's a fraction of the people voting too. It's not even
true. Yeah. But like, because this is never going to appeal to 100% of people and be believed by 100% of people. But if it's believed by 15 or 20%, if it's the right 15 or 20%, it can make major change.
Right, exactly.
And the goal is to end up using this as sort of like a more unbiased sort of end-to-end version of like Snopes or something, where somebody says, well, here's, what's true or not. And it shows why we think that, all the evidence involved. And one of the big things is admitting when we don't know.
Yeah.
When we're like, we don't have enough scientific, information available, or hasn't been reviewed, or whatever is happening. And then also admitting this might not be the end state. If we have 10% of the scientific studies on a certain topic, maybe, certain ones in there are going to throw a wrench in what we currently think is true about that topic.
Right. Yeah. I think 3 very important things are, the ability to admit when you're wrong, the ability to say, I don't know, and that's okay. And the idea that there's no end goal. This is a process. It's a process now, and it's always a process.
Exactly. This is always a summary of what we know today. Based on the information that we have available, here's what it is. And I think that's one of the big things people misunderstand about science and about a lot of the stuff that we take for granted, is it's always based on what's there. So science can, quite commonly get proven wrong, but a certain thing that we believe is proven wrong. It's like, yeah, but now that it's proven wrong, we're a little bit more right.
Right, exactly.
And it's not holding that against it, because that's very much how science works. And it can be hard in the early days to figure out, okay, like, back when we first figured out that the Earth was round. Well, at that time, at first there was 100% of people believed that it was flat. And then one person had some evidence that says, oh, maybe it's not. Well, using this model, if it was the 1 versus the 99%, you might think, oh, that person's wrong. But then you look at how accurate is that person. If that first person to go against the grain is just like amazing at their job, and they're right all over the board, and they're always ahead of the curve, you say, oh, maybe that person is changing it. Like, and maybe they're actually the one that's right, and they have some new revelation, as opposed to, no, science is pretty clear on this, and that person was just bought and paid for.
Right.
And they're, just an expert that's being paid to say, well, actually, we aren't quite sure. And their history doesn't show anything magnificent. They actually have been proven to be wrong in a lot of cases, or like, this is the first thing that they've said. We really don't know the history of this person and how good they are at this. So, take it with a grain of salt.
Right. I think it's important for people too to understand about science and a lot of things that proof is asymmetrical. So, I could prove pretty much that something is not the case, but I could never actually 100% prove that it is the case.
Right.
And a lot of the general public thinks that, well, it's symmetrical. Since I can prove something's not the case, I should be able to prove something is the case too.
Right. Exactly.
And when
It's like
when you can't do that,
prove that Santa doesn't exist. You can prove that he's not here. You can prove that maybe that's not where certain gifts come from, etc. But you can never be 100% certain. So it ends up being, okay, but is there proof that he does exist? Because if you can't prove one the other way, and then it puts the onus on, well, then we should probably wait for proof of something. What kind of proof is possible? Then that's what we have to understand. That's how scientific, as you said, it's asymmetrical. It's the area where we actually could prove something. If we can't disprove something, or we can't prove that something doesn't exist, then that's not how we should think about it. It's, is there proof they do exist? Because that's the only option that we have.
Right. Well, this has been really great, Adriel.
Thank you for showing up. It's nice to actually start to have some questions and some feedback and some back and forth on this.
Yeah.
Start to understand the questions people have.
Yeah, no, this is really amazing what you're doing here, and I think this needs to get out there as soon as you're ready to do it.
Thanks. That's the goal. Let's switch views here. Get rid of that.
Yeah. So I'd like to help out more in any way I can.
Sure. Yeah. Probably one of the best things to do to start with is just to follow the Facebook page, because that's where a lot of the new information comes out.
Okay.
And then right now the goal is I'm trying to build the community to get more people involved, even just from watching videos and asking questions. Is a big part of it is starting to understand, like, what do you need to be able to trust an information source, and what do you need to be able to trust an organization, and to stop making decisions just based on what I think. Because this all started from, what do I need to be able to know in order to know if something is true or not? But that's going to be different for everyone. So it's to get as big of a sampling as possible, to start showing things and to start getting feedback from a big group of people. And then the eventual goal is to, start getting some funding to actually pay people to program this. Because one of the difficulties is, the end goal is, I don't want it to, it's never going to be a for-profit project, but it is going to need sort of like world-class talent, because it's taking on issues that big companies haven't been able to solve. Like Facebook and Google are trying to solve this, but they're so deep into it that I don't think people would trust them if they did solve it anyway. And there's going to be a constant, if this starts to take off, there's going to be a constant barrage of, attacks on the infrastructure and people trying to discredit it. And so it'll end up needing to be a really interesting project from like a world-class talent, but run in a way that no project that I'm aware of has been run before.
Right.
Like a weird mix of like an enterprise level project and open source.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of, there's been a lot of discussions on in the Game B space about just that.
Right.
What kind of projects, what kind of companies, can bootstrap in the Game A space, but be coming from the Game B space.
Right. Exactly. Like a Game B company operating in a Game A world.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
In the current model, like, a lot of Game A stuff is law. Like, you have to do certain things if you're going to operate, period. And so it's being able to operate within those rules while going towards something that maybe will eventually shift those laws or shift how we're doing things and to find new ways.
Right. Go
ahead.
Oh, yeah. Well, a new way of shifting the laws, instead of coming from a position of influence and money and power, which currently shifts the laws.
Right. Yeah. Which, to be honest, we might even use that, right? Like there's an article on The Onion that is satire, but is it? Where it's a joke saying like some citizens got together and hired a lobbyist to, push their points to the politicians. And it's like, it's good, that now we'll actually have a voice with the politicians. And you're like, that's uncomfortably close to not being satire.
Right. Well, I think at some point too, you have to say, okay, this is where I am. This is what I have at my disposal,
Right.
and I'm going to have to co-opt some of the stuff. I'm going to have to almost parasitize some of the stuff.
Yep.
It's just what I have to work with, and that's what we have to do.
Exactly. And it's, in this case, a lot of it is to do whatever is necessary, but without violating a law, because you can't do much from prison, but then also doing things that wouldn't violate the public trust. Like, even if it's things that aren't against the law, if it's something that a game company might do to get ahead, even though one of the goals has to be to get ahead, because you have to be able to compete, it can't be in a way that would make people not trust the end result. So it's like, oh, well, they're doing stuff, but they're pretty sketchy themselves, so maybe we don't trust that group.
Exactly.
Yeah, it becomes quite tough.
Yeah, I think important is that if you're doing that, it's transparent, but you also have to be on guard because, if you're transparent, you have to be ready that someone is going to hijack and weaponize your transparency.
Exactly. And like an example is if we have fully transparent, like, the board meetings. Well, a lot of big companies have very secure board meetings where, like, I actually work for a company that helps secure like board materials and board conversations for Fortune 500 companies. The security is a massive focus there. So this is kind of the opposite of that, where it's like, if you wanted to say, oh, look what this company is doing and look at how their board operates, it's very easy because currently for Together Tech, that's being recorded on YouTube. So they can weaponize that transparency, but then it's also, well, if you want to criticize ours, then put your board meetings online or shut up.
Right.
And it's fighting battles that really have never been fought in that way.
Yeah.
And like, if you're trying to operate in that way, in this new model that no one's ever seen, it'll be an interesting thing if this actually takes off and we're starting to fight those battles publicly, because if it's successful, it's going to have a lot of enemies.
Right.
And to be able to prepare for where those attacks come from and what kind of things, which also goes into the not everything will be able to be fully transparent. Like, one of the things that's going to be vitally important is like computer security and information security and verifying and validating that members are who they say they are.
Right.
Like, for the election parts, probably anybody will be able to see it. But if you want to participate in the election conversation, you're going to have to prove that you're able to vote in that election.
Right.
Like, as much as people in Canada are interested in the US election, if we're actually saying, like, I want the politician to answer this question, the politician should probably know that only voters are able to say that. So if people say that I want to know about this issue, that's people who may or may not vote for you. So you should probably answer that.
Right. Yeah, I think for all its shortcomings that are becoming apparent as time goes on, but I think the idea behind blockchain was very interesting, and that was that it's simultaneously transparent or more transparent, and it's much, much more secure. Right. I mean, to hack a blockchain is like a far more difficult enterprise than existing databases.
It's interesting because it's like, typically security and privacy kind of go hand in hand, but blockchain sort of just takes half. You're like, actually, it's secure, but not really private because that database exists possibly thousands of times over.
Right.
So it's this weird, like, and you can't always relate it back to what it was, but the information in that database is still very accessible, but really hard to fake. And so that's where blockchain gets super interesting. And there's a very good chance that part of Wikilection will use blockchain, especially if the community is like, hey, in these areas, we really need to use blockchain, or this big group of people won't trust it. Cool. Then we'll probably use blockchain.
Right. Yeah, there is some really interesting blockchain stuff going on, like with Cosmos, where they're basically creating an internet of blockchains. So it's interoperable blockchains.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah, that's and then there's the whole thing that moves away from blockchain, which is holochain and everything.
Right.
I think both areas are really worth investigating more.
Yeah, I think right now, partially just because I come from like sort of the typical B2B enterprise software world, it's going to be handled very much like that kind of a project where like
Right.
the first version probably isn't going to use blockchain at all. But it's open to that if the public really needs it to be able to trust it, cool, we can explore that. Or if there's just a really good reason to. Like if we say we
Right.
can, there's a big reason to, but with all like a lot of those technologies, where right now, like as a society, we're still kind of trying to figure out where they fit in, and like from AI and blockchain and 3D printing and all this stuff, we're trying to figure out how that works. And I know some people I've talked to are like, it has to be on blockchain or the whole thing is pointless, but I don't think the average person thinks that way. And really it's about trying to appeal to the biggest group possible. And even if we use blockchain, it won't become a central part of the messaging because most people don't care about that.
Right. Right. And yeah, I agree with you. I think you're going about the right way. I think you're developing this model, which is independent of, the substrate at that level. So you're building a model that has, I mean, that alone is huge. And then making decisions later on about, how is this database going to exist? Is it going to be blockchain? Is it going to be, standard? Is it going to be some combination? I think first what you're doing is what needs to be done, and those questions can be addressed later.
Yeah, because as I think I've said multiple times, if people don't trust it or if they don't understand it, or there's a lot of areas where it can fail.
Right.
It really needs to like get all the things in a row and things have to align in order for it to work. But a big part of it is because it's software, it can pretty easily adjust and, deal with it. And for the first while, it's like, there's not going to be that big of a public facing side. Like one of the things that I'm thinking of doing is for the first while, there's kind of going to be two different sides to the politician history. One will actually be politicians where people can sort of go in there and muck around and add information and see how they can do it, but that wouldn't be public. Then the other side is to have fictional characters, like especially fictional politicians, where people can go in there and add information, and that would be public, just to sort of show here's what that might look like for how you might summarize a politician without actually, damaging anybody's reputation while we're still figuring out how things work.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. It's almost like, testing it out in almost like a game environment.
Right, exactly. Because a part of it is this has the potential, like especially if it starts to gain traction and people start to be interested in it, there's, it's not to say how that timeline will correspond to when the information coming out of it is trustworthy. Because in the early stages, right, it's, it's going to be just like any other software project where there's going to be prototypes and pre-alphas and alphas and betas and closed betas and open betas and the whole thing. Right. And there's going to be points where like you might go in there and look at it, be like, well, it's saying that the information is, is accurate, but then you drill into it and you're like, that's obviously garbage. Like any expert you ask is saying that that's not true. How did that happen? And then you figure it out until you're at the point where like you can take an important topic like something like climate change and vaccines and start to have a conversation with either side. And even if they don't like what is being shown, they can look at it and say, it kind of feels like you're, it's being fair. It's giving equal opportunity to both sides and saying, prove your point.
Right.
And if you can prove it and the other side is saying, I don't agree, but I can't poke holes in it because everything it's showing me, you're like, you can drill it down as far as you want. And the assumptions and summaries and the reviews all make sense. Crap, I think it might be right.
Right. Yeah. And I'm, if I think if a person is working in this environment over a period of time, that they'll learn to become, okay with that. It's like, I wish things weren't like this, but it looks like they are. Okay. So now I have to adjust, based on my worldview, how to deal with the facts instead of always trying to adjust the facts to my worldview.
Right. Exactly. And there's going to be, I think, a fair amount of time where those like the software and the summaries are going to be closed so that the public can't go and see. Because especially for something like climate change or vaccines, both sides have to trust the process. And if you show them something that like has been gamed, where like, oh, we didn't account for this, they lose trust and they might never regain it. But whereas, no, we weren't ready yet. You shouldn't trust it yet. We're still trying to figure out the processes and trying to get people to game it and trying to see, how can they skew it to the point where even if people really want to, they can't break it in their favor, or like it's really hard to, and we can pinpoint where it's happening. Then to the point, where it might be a year or two of closed, and where we say it's open, and now, like, we're actually confident that if a politician's profile says something, even if they sue, we're like, nope, we can prove this in court. Everything here stands up to it.
Right.
And that's what you're trying to avoid.
Right. Well, that's interesting, is to have that level of, that the legal system has a certain burden of proof, and to actually be able to pass that threshold as well.
Yeah. And that's one of the areas where, like, if this takes off and we end up being, sort of like actually having enough funding to be a fairly major software company, one of the major areas is just going to be legal stuff, because that's where we're going to be challenged constantly.
Right.
From all the sides, right? From the politician profile to the elections to the science stuff, and being sued by lobbies that say that the misinformation that they've been paying to generate for years, all of a sudden we just decimate it. And so that they might sue it to be like, oh, well, this isn't true, but we have the legal clout and a system that can show all the burden of proof in the world, where it needs to be able to be resistant to that, and then also, of course, pay for legal fees.
Right.
Which is the tough part of being able to operate in that. And that's sort of where Together Tech comes in, where it's sort of that the network of all the apps will sort of have similar things, because a bunch of the Game B projects are going to have those kinds of challenges, are going to have the people who are rooted and the people who are making money off of it, and their livelihoods are dependent on that misinformation or on that weird slice of game A that maybe really should be changed. We're going to have that part dialed.
Right. Well, that's why it's important to operate in terms of ecosystems where, everybody, no matter what they're doing, it's incumbent upon them to support the ecosystem. Right. So, if WikiLeaks comes under attack, I might be working in agriculture or something, but it's in my interest to my resources with everybody else in the system, and help pay those legal fees.
Yeah, exactly. And so for like the start of it is, I think the initial funding is going to be a combination of Patreon and just me paying for it. And then sort of once it gets a big enough community, it'll probably end up being a Kickstarter, where like people who contribute money will sort of have more access to the development stage, and they'll probably be the initial members and community people who get access to the closed alpha and closed beta. And that's, I think, sort of what they'll get. And then we'll figure out what else the community wants, because it's going to be a weird sort of thing, like something that I don't think I've ever talked to someone who didn't get like why this was important. I've never been like, is that actually a problem? I haven't heard that once. I've talked to a lot of people about this in sort of varying levels of depth.
Right.
And I haven't once heard like, is misinformation a problem? It's usually, oh, how are you going to handle this and this and this and this and that? And I think a lot of projects are probably like that. And so I think, as we've been talking about, to build an ecosystem where the same challenges that Wikilection is likely to face are likely to be faced by a bunch of these sort of world-changing projects.
Right. Definitely.
Cool. All right, I think we can probably cut at least the broadcast off here. We went a bit past the normal time.
That's okay. It was a very interesting discussion. Bye.
Do this. We can